Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Talent Gap Fireside Chat, where we talk about causes of and solutions to the talent gap. I'm your host, Pete Strauss, and joining me today is Michael Meese. He's an associate CISO over at University of Kansas Health System. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Pete. Happy to be here.
Well, thanks for being here. We've interacted quite a bit on LinkedIn, and I think have shared some best practices, but for those that don't know you, could you give our audience a little background on yourself and your career thus far?
Yeah, sure. As you mentioned, my name is Michael Meese. I currently am the Associate CISO for the University of Kansas Health System. I really started out my career when I joined the Army at 19 and went into signal communications and communication protection. So dovetailed a little bit into radio signal encryption and fun things like that. And then that kind of naturally progressed over into the IT and InfoSec security. And so then when I got out of the Army, DoD was waiting there to hire me into that role. So I spent about 8 years doing consulting work for various federal agencies. DoD was the first of those, and spent a lot of time in a lot of different areas, but probably most notably was I spent about 5 years in an incident response role building a SOC, and learned a lot of great lessons there. And then when I left the government space, I went to H&R Block for a couple of years and rebuilt their GRC program, and I really kind of fell in love with risk quantification and GRC as a discipline. And really enjoyed that role. And then about 2.5 years ago, I left that to come to the health system, and it's been a blast learning the healthcare space and really getting to dig my teeth into protecting the systems that help keep people alive.
Very cool. Yeah, and security then becomes literally a matter of life and death. So, you're certainly doing important work there. It's really interesting that you've worked on both the technical side, private sector, GRC, government. You've pretty much done it all. So have you noticed that hiring is different in all of those different areas within the field? Like, are there certain challenges that you've encountered in one aspect of security in the private sector, say, versus government sector, or healthcare versus H&R Block?
Yeah, very much so. So when you're talking about hiring within an industry, there's realities of each industry that you have to account for. So government, they're famous for their red tape. They're famous for how slow things move. They're famous for not paying as much as some other industries. And so it really takes a very mission-driven person in order to navigate that type of an environment and be successful. And they have very stringent credentialing requirements. So it has to be people who are dedicated towards not only professional development, but then continuing to get certs and things that, they can exemplify to the government that they know that information. And then when you move into the private sector, it changes because it moves faster. There's more career opportunities at different paces. And so you're looking for different personalities again there. And then when it comes to the different areas of security, it's very similar. I was in an identity role for a while that required very detail-oriented people who would test things exhaustively before pushing them into production because identity is so pervasive. Then you have incident response, where you need people who can think on their feet, handle pressure very well, and be able to make quick decisions. And then in a GRC role, where you need people who will, dig in, very analytical, but then also people who have people skills, because risk management done in a vacuum is kind of pointless. And so you have to be able to communicate those results to other people. And so it does change the skill sets that you're looking for, depending on what type of security you're in, what industry you're in, et cetera. But then it also changes the personalities that you're looking for, because different people get bored in different roles if it's not a good fit for their kind of default operating style.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you bring up an interesting point that we haven't really talked about before on the podcast, is personality. How do people fit into various subdisciplines within the security field? Like a GRC role, probably not the right role for somebody who's a very, very creative type, but you want somebody who's, analytical and detail oriented and, dots their I's and crosses their T's. Whereas
Right.
a good pen tester probably isn't going to be a very good pen tester if they're not very, creative and thinking outside the box. So yeah,
Right.
that's one thing we don't think about a lot in the field. Um, and obviously the various challenges, they kind of factor into the talent gap as we see it or as we talk about. In your mind, would you say that it's a real thing? And if so, what do you think it looks like?
Yes and no. So I do think there is a talent gap, but I don't think it's quite as pronounced as people make it out to be. So I think it's first important to understand our industry as part of, a global economy and a global talent force, because there are a variety of industries that are facing a talent gap at the same time, and it's because of global factors that are occurring right now. And so, yes, I do think there is a talent gap, but I think that once those factors have kind of run their course, I think that we will see that talent gap shrink, just like many other labor industries that are facing the same thing are going to. That being said, I do think that the industry has not done a very good job of prioritizing kind of the next generation of our workforce, and so I think a lot of the people that we depend on today are nearing retirement in the next 5 to 10 years, whether that's retiring completely or just retiring from this industry. And we've not done a very good job at prioritizing and preparing people to backfill them. And so I think the talent gap isn't as much in our today needs as it is in 5 years. I think that we're going to realize that we haven't been preparing that next generation, and then we will really see a talent gap at leadership roles, a talent gap in thoughts and ideas, because so few people have been exposed and have the experience to be able to be a subject matter expert, 5, 10, 15 years from now.
Yeah, I totally see it the same way. We're in a situation where in this economy, companies are like, okay, well, the market is flooded with very experienced people. If that's the case, why would we spend the time and resources to train somebody when
Right.
there's plenty of experienced people on the market right now?
Right.
But I always ask, whose responsibility is it to train these
Mhm.
people? Because if the shortages do get worse in the coming years, say the economy rebounds in a couple of years,
Mhm.
everybody's going to be wanting to hire seniors again, and at that point, everybody's going to be snapped up, and there's nobody left. And you could make the argument that maybe AI will step in and plug some of
Mhm.
these holes, but I don't know how confident I am in that. And at the end of the day, you're going to need good senior, well trained people that have been in the trenches, so to speak, to run
Mhm.
these tools. And nobody's really thinking about, okay, well, I'll take this on because nobody else is.
Mhm.
It's always kind of a not my problem thing from what I'm seeing out there. So, any thoughts on that? Like, whose responsibility is it to train the junior folks, and how can we build a business case to do that?
Yeah, so I think it's more about taking a longer term view towards talent. A lot of organizations, very over the past 20 years, have taken a very quarter to quarter type of approach, not just to talent management, but just business in general. Which I think we see a lot of the impacts of that across the economy. And so I think that talent is just one of the places where we need to stop thinking in what problem am I facing today, and start thinking about building sustainable processes that are going to make our teams and our organizations successful, 3, 5, 10, 15 years down the road. And so what I always encourage people to do is to build a talent pipeline where you're able to find, train, and compensate entry level personnel. And so, what that may look like is maybe you get them in at very, very low salaries when they come right out of college, and then you're giving them raises every 3 to 6 months for the first 2 to 3 years that they work for you. And while that may not sound attractive on the surface, when you're looking at the economic proposal of it, you're saving money over that first couple of years, while also building something sustainable, where if one of those seniors start to leave, you have this pool of internal people that you can start to push into those roles. And so it's really about presenting a 2, 3, 5 year picture to your HR department and to your operational leadership, et cetera. And it's not about just hiring like one entry level person. It's about creating a process to where you can continuously bring in these newer career people and be able to elevate them and have them prepared for the role, and then be okay if they end up leaving because you may not have a spot for them. So it's focusing on not only developing them, but also developing your organization to where you have resilience, to where that kind of churn that inevitably happens with new career positions and new career individuals, that you're not so reliant on that one person that there's this massive gap every time they leave.
Yeah, it kind of goes to the security idea of backups and recovery and redundancy. If you have somebody ready to take over those responsibilities, one of the best guests I've had mentioned that his best practice is just constant succession planning. Like, we're always training people at the lower levels to move up into the senior levels if somebody leaves. And if you're, like you said, constantly developing that pipeline, you're just moving people through constantly. And that's certainly a best practice. And you mentioned a good point about the short-term thinking. I've been harping on about that for years now. And it's like you said, it's just a problem in business overall. The executives look at quarterly profits. The more line management folks, they're worrying more so about getting their day-to-day, tactical types of things done. They don't worry so much about the strategy of things, and they get really bogged down in the day-to-day responsibilities of managing some people. So I think we have kind of two separate problems there, where the executives are thinking short term for their own reasons, and the line managers are thinking short term for their own reasons. And I have to think the lack of company loyalty these days has to factor into that as well. I think if everybody's a short term thinker because they don't know that they're going to be around the company in a year, what incentive do they have to build a long term vision for the company and strategy and things like that? So we don't live in the world anymore of people staying with their companies 30 years. People don't have pensions anymore. I guess, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, how can we get people to think about long term if they don't plan on sticking around for the long term?
I think it's about getting people to buy into something larger than themselves. And it used to be a company. For our parents' generation, they bought into the company and they were there for, 20, 30, 40 years. And as you mentioned, those days are gone. But I still think the concept of buying into something larger than yourself is a huge driver in people's decisions. Obviously, everybody has bills to pay, so compensation is going to be a huge piece of that. But being able to get people behind a vision, whether that's for your security organization, whether that's what the larger organization is trying to do, or the larger team is trying to do, but really getting people behind a vision of what they're doing so that their day-to-day tasks and their day-to-day work means something larger than them just completing a day-to-day task is going to be huge. And then the second piece of it is, it's not rocket science, and tons of people have said it before me, but just giving people an opportunity to grow. Very, very few people want to come in and just do the exact same thing for the next 10 years every day. And so being able to give them new tasks, new problems to solve. And there have been a lot of creative ideas that people have put out on how to tackle that. There was a concept called tours of duty, where you do like a 12-month rotation on one team for one specific project, and then you rotate. You can either sign up for another 12 months with that team, or you can rotate to a different team. There's job rotations. There's internal promotions, obviously, but you really need to focus on being able to giving people kind of something new to chew on. In order to get them to continuously rebuy into your company and rebuy into your team. Otherwise, you will be constantly replacing people at all levels because they'll just get bored, and it's easy to find money somewhere else. It's not always easy to find purpose and direction and ability to grow at other organizations.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point in that people don't have loyalty to employers anymore, but that's not to say that they wouldn't have loyalty to a good manager or a good team. If you can really create a cohesive team where everybody's extremely happy, your retention rates are going to shoot through the roof, even if you're not paying top dollar. Like, yeah, in some cases, people are going to move on because they got offered double salary, or something like that, in which case, who could blame them? But if you're really purposeful in building a team that is cohesive and, their personalities mesh and they have room for growth. I think it was Mandiant or maybe some other consulting firms that really popularized the rotation program. They did a great job of that for years that I saw pre-acquisition. I'm not sure if they're still doing it. But yeah, that's a great way to do it. Giving people the ability through, I think, having sit downs with them either quarterly or once a year, whatever it may be, career planning sessions where you really suss out what it is that they want to do. Are they happy and fulfilled in their current role? In some cases, you may not be able to move that person around because you have a small team and there's no budget or no room or no other department to move them to, in which case you got to figure out something kind of creative to, hang on to that person, allow them to develop professionally. Have you encountered that situation where you had somebody that was kind of feeling restless and you had to get creative with how to keep them sticking around? Because I know you think about retention a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when I worked in the government space, because the government is not built for career mobility. And so we had to get very, very creative with how we accomplished people's career goals. And so oftentimes, as you mentioned, just have a conversation with the person and make it a partnership on reaching their career goals and where they're trying to head. And just that act alone is going to buy you huge amounts of credibility with that individual. Just the fact that you're taking an interest in their career and what they want to do. And then you can't think in the box of the way every other corporation or every other organization does it. And even if it's something to where maybe you give them an hour off once a week to go work on something completely different from their job, if that's what they're interested in. It doesn't always have to be a formal assignment. It doesn't always have to be a formal part of their job. You can get really creative with what you expose them to. For example, we had a SOC analyst who really, really wanted to go into threat intelligence. We didn't have any threat intelligence roles at the time. That was owned by another consulting company. And so what we did is I went and talked to the company that owned that contract, explained kind of what was going on. And what they agreed to was to have a 1 hour basically coaching session with their threat intel lead every week with that individual. And so no, threat intel was not part of his job, but he was able to get coached in threat intelligence, which eventually prepared him to move into a threat intel role. And in the meantime, he ended up staying another 1.5 years in that role. Whereas, I can't say for certain, but I don't think he would have lasted another 6 months had we not been able to kind of give him that opportunity to start dipping his toe into something else. And then he felt like he was supported moving on to his next career goal instead of just focusing on the role he's in today.
Yeah, and I would imagine in order to get that sort of candid feedback from somebody that's, underneath you, that you would have to have, up to that point, develop some trust and rapport and things like that, so they feel comfortable coming to you or honestly, or just being honest with you about like what's really going on. I think a lot of times people's first answer isn't necessarily the reality. It's like I always say about screening people, you really have to dig past the surface because their first answer is rarely what's really going on. So any best practices for developing trust with employees to where they're going to come to you if they're unhappy, whereas otherwise, they might just move on without saying anything?
Yeah. So I'm a parent. I have 3 kids, and very early on in my parenting journey, somebody told me that you have to listen when your kids are telling you the small things, or otherwise they won't tell you the big things, because to them it was all big things. And I think that rule applies to leadership as well. Is generally people will start with something very small that they don't care for. It may be a quick vent or something like that. And whether consciously or subconsciously, they are looking to see how you react and what you do about it. And it may be something as small as somebody interrupting them in a meeting and you saying, "Hey, so-and-so is talking." And little things like that can really start to build rapport to where they understand that when they have a problem, you are on their side. The other thing that I always encourage people to do is to give multiple channels for people to be able to provide feedback. There are some of the most intelligent people that I have ever met that will say almost nothing in a one-on-one meeting, in a group meeting, et cetera. They do not want to talk. And so by having multiple channels, you can make sure that you can get kind of an accurate look of what's going on without shoeboxing everyone into one type of feedback. So we do a variety of different channels on my current team where we have one-on-one meetings, we have skip level meetings, we have what we call pulse surveys that are sent out once a month that are a chance for people to provide feedback in written form. We accept emails, just all of these different channels and avenues for people to talk about how they're feeling and what they're experiencing in a way that is comfortable to them. And it's almost comical the different ways that people have brought up the exact same problem, largely driven by their personality and how comfortable they are with me or with their manager or with their director. And so I think having that variety of feedback channels really makes sure that you can really hear what's going on, regardless of how comfortable someone is with any particular medium.
That's such a great point, and one that I hadn't considered before, for sure. Like, I think about myself, for whatever reason, I'm just more comfortable with email and text-based communications because it allows me to, I'm very analytical and kind of neurotic. So I always think so much about every single thing that I type out, and I go back and delete stuff, and then I add more things just because I want it to be perfect when it goes out.
Right.
And I had that pounded into my head too, attention to detail by CPAs, which doesn't help. But yeah, so if somebody was asking me for candid feedback, yeah, I would have a hard time probably telling somebody face to face because I'm a people pleaser. I don't want to, rock the boat, so to speak. So that's a really good.
And when you're talking about power dynamics, giving feedback to your direct manager about how they're not supporting you is often not something people are comfortable doing. So having things like a skip level where they could talk to somebody who's maybe not directly responsible for the things that are happening and kind of feel a little bit safer. And so there's a variety of reasons why you need different channels, but a lot of people leaders think, have a one-on-one meeting and I'll find out everything that way. And, that sounds great in a box, but it's not how it works with real people.
Yeah. And as a recruiter, I can tell you, I've run into so many scenarios where I thought I had a handle on the situation, but people are fickle. There's nothing you can do about that. It's just the nature of human nature, I suppose.
Right.
What about in the interview process? Obviously, human nature comes into that through recruiting and interviewing.
Yep.
Any ideas and best practices or challenges around hiring, interviewing, recruiting? How does the people element factor into that in your experience?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people approach interviewing too much like a formula that you need to solve. If you ask X and Y, you'll get Z. And again, I think people are not that simple. And so what I really try to focus on is a conversation with focused topics where I'm trying to get an answer to a question. So, but the way you're going to approach it will depend entirely on the personality of that individual. And so what I always recommend to everyone is to go into it with an open mind and learn about that person while also letting them learn about you. And so oftentimes in an interview, like you're asking a bunch of questions for 45 minutes and then the last 15 minutes, do you have any questions for me? And if you think about the way human interactions work, that would be wild in any other setting. If you were at a bar and you did that with a friend, that would just be the weirdest thing ever. And so I always encourage people to make it much more conversational. And it really gives you a chance to know the real person behind the application, behind their resume, and behind whatever scripted answers they prepared to your star interview questions. And just be able to talk about kind of what the role is going to be doing, what challenges the team is facing, what challenges they're going to face in that role, and really share with them as much as they're asking questions of you. And you're asking questions of them, is just be able to openly share and talk to them like you would a new friend that you were meeting at a restaurant. And in my experience, I've been able to really connect with people a lot better and really get a better understanding of kind of who they are, their aspirations, and what they're trying to accomplish. And in my opinion, I've gotten a lot better results from my interviews because of that.
Yeah, that's great. Most of the really good hiring managers I've worked with over the years, they have a more conversational interview style.
Yep.
And you bring up a couple of good points there about if you wait till one being, if you wait till the end to ask them if there's any questions, half the time they'll just blank because they just sat through 45 minutes of questions to them, and they're in the right space to remember all of the 15 questions that they had memorized for this interview.
Yep.
Whereas, if you give them the chance to ask questions organically throughout the process, like you said, it's more of a conversation. I think you get more of a sense of their ability to converse, which is important in a lot of security roles that people expect. And if you're just, questions to the person, and then allow them to ask questions at the end, you really have no idea. Say you're a GRC consulting firm and they're an external auditor. You have no idea how they're going to talk to a client if you approach the interview that way, because you didn't have a conversation with them. I just use that example because it's something close to my heart, having worked with so many consulting firms over the years. But yeah, that's a great way to go about it. What about, I kind of mentioned getting the best out of people. Any other best practices to, I guess, put people at ease or make sure that you're getting an authentic picture of what that person's actually like versus a mask or a veneer, that they're putting up for the interview?
Yeah, I mean, some of it's going to be a bit of intuition and experience, which I know is, not the best answer, but you just kind of get a feel for people. You're going to make some hiring mistakes. And then once they get into the role and, they're not quite what they presented themselves in their interview, you'll kind of say like, oh, I probably had a feeling of that in the interview, but I kind of, glossed over it. So some of it you learn by experience. But I think the number one way that I've gotten people to relax is kind of taking the veneer off myself first. Is I'm just a person. You're just a person. I have a story. I have a family. I have a background, etc. And so sometimes just sharing something about myself as an individual kind of puts them at ease. Like I'm not this castle on the hill that, you need to come beg for a job. I'm just a person, and let's talk like people. And so I think that if you can open up first and just kind of set the tone for the rest of the interview, because as the interviewer, you are in a position of power. And so you are going to be dictating the way the rest of the interview goes, the tone, the pace of it, etc. And so I think it's really up to us to start from the beginning to set that tone for the rest of the interview. And oftentimes just opening up yourself and kind of taking the shine off of your position, off of your title, off of your resume, etc. Can really help them to start to view you as a person and then start to talk to you like a person, where you can really get a better understanding of who they are.
Yeah, so you're almost kind of leading by example. You're showing leadership in an interview. So that's great to hear. I could see where it might go too far the other way, though, too, where you don't get the best out of people because they're too comfortable. Has that ever happened? And, could you think of any way to prevent that while you're kind of breaking down all these walls, not to break it down too much?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you still want to maintain a professional decorum, et cetera. And again, it goes back to the tone that you're setting. If you're opening the interview by cursing and asking how much they partied over the weekend and talking about the party you went to, like that's going to change the conversation quite a bit. But you can share in a professional way that really sets that professional tone. But in a way, how far they take it gives you insight into them as a person as well. Is that's a balance you have to find in professional life every day. We all have lives outside of the office. We share pieces of that lives with our employer and with our coworker. But there's, a line that we don't share and probably shouldn't share. Although that's changed a lot since COVID started. But really their ability to kind of find that line in the interview is an indicator in and of itself of a skill that a professional needs to have.
For sure. Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, you learn more about somebody when their guard is down, for good or for bad.
Yep.
And you do want to weed some people out at the end of the day. That's
Yep.
I hate to say that's the sole purpose of an interview, because I don't think it's the sole purpose, but you do want to make sure that you're making the right hiring decision and you're
Right.
qualifying people. What about you? You kind of alluded to this. Obviously, everybody's made a few mistakes or encountered a few stumbling blocks over the years. Can you think of an example, some sort of hiring situation where you made a hire and that person didn't work out? And looking back, you mentioned that you might have seen some red flags, but you kind of overlooked them. What did you learn from that experience?
Yeah. So I'll fall on my own sword a bit. I had a friend that I went to training with in the Army. We were in the same training course for about 6 months together. And then when I started doing contracting work a couple of years later, he surfaced and said, "Hey, I do network security. I'm looking for a job." And I said, "I got an open spot." And so I interviewed him. And he didn't seem to know what he was talking about. He was overly casual, as you mentioned, and I kind of chalked it up to, we're friends. He was overly casual because he knew me already, et cetera. And we went ahead and moved forward with him. Turns out he was just overly casual all the time, which, especially in a government setting and with sometimes senior government employees, that becomes a problem very, very quickly. And so I kind of overlooked it because of my existing relationship with him. And so what that taught me, and a friend of mine has a friend and mentor of mine has talked about this at length, but really separating the person and the professional, especially when you know somebody outside of work, if you've hung out, if you've been friends before, et cetera, is you really have to be able to kind of suspend what you know about them as a person outside of work, and then what you know about them as a professional. Because there's a lot of people who are fantastic professionals who I have no desire to ever go hang out with outside of work. And then vice versa, people who I have a close relationship with, have known for, a decade or longer, and I would not even think twice about hiring them. And so being able to kind of separate the person from how they behave at work and what you need and what's good for your environment becomes really, really important when you're in a hiring role.
For sure. Yeah. And that leads me to think about biases. And I often say, I think one of the most common biases is like me bias. And the idea that people want to hire somebody that's either a carbon copy of themselves, or somebody that maybe they see as aspirational, or somebody that basically they would want to get a beer with, versus somebody that's the best fit for the role. So how do you separate that and ensure that you're hiring the person that's the best fit for the role, that has the right qualifications, but that also has the right culture fit, without just hiring somebody that you just want to get a beer with?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways. Is number one, understand your own bias first. Is spend time on some introspection and really understand your own bias. I think that is the first and most effective key, is some self-awareness to know, what you are prone to, what are kind of your positive and negative triggers, and how you can account for those, and really being aware of the impact that it has on you mentally and emotionally. And then the second part is to have different perspectives. For example, every hiring position that I'm in, I always have someone who has a completely different perspective than me. I've identified them as someone who operates differently, who we don't generally see eye to eye on things. And whether they're a people leader or an individual contributor, I will generally have them interview everyone who I'm thinking of hiring. to get that kind of completely different perspective. And we usually don't agree, but we find a middle ground, and then I understand that perspective. And oftentimes it helps me identify areas where maybe I was kind of having my head in the sand or looking a different way. And you have to temper that a bit, because you can try to pursue so many different perspectives. You end up with like 10 rounds of interviews, which isn't going to work either. But really being able to bring in different perspectives to the table, to be able to challenge your thought process and challenge your bias is going to help you ultimately see things more objectively and get a more accurate representation of who that person is.
Yeah, it's actually the second time now somebody's mentioned just getting a diversity of perspectives is a good way to counter your bias. How do you make yourself aware of your own biases in the first place? Because kind of by definition, you wouldn't know that they existed, or else they wouldn't be a bias. So how do you identify those in yourself? Like, do you ask other people, or how do you do that through self-reflection, or is it something that you have to go external to find out?
It's a bit of both, and I don't want to get too philosophical, but spending some time with yourself, I think, is really important. We live in a hyper-connected world that is moving very, very quickly, and is always demanding your attention. And very few people spend time just thinking with themselves. And so I think that is a huge first step, is just to spend time thinking about yourself, thinking about your thought processes. And then the second piece of it is going external, reading different perspectives, having mentors with different perspectives, talking to peers who have different perspectives. It helps you to learn and to appreciate different worldviews. For example, I am in a professional development group. We go out to dinner once a month. And almost all of us come from different roles. There's one other CISO in the group, and everyone else is in some type of a sales or a revenue type role. And we all have very different paths to success and very different personalities. And so I'm a hyper competitive person, and I've always thought that the most successful people in the world were people who were hyper competitive. And then I meet these group of people who are all as equally, if not more, successful than I am, and none of them are competitive at all. They think it's strange how competitive I am, and I think it's strange that they're not competitive. And so it really opened up my worldview of competitive. You don't have to be hyper competitive in order to be successful. And so just intentionally exposing yourself to different perspectives and different worldviews and different types of people is going to naturally help you to identify, maybe my thought process isn't the gospel truth for the only way to do things. And then you can kind of open up from there.
Yeah, makes sense. I'm actually the same way, hyper competitive. And I always thought everybody in sales that was, results oriented would inherently be hyper competitive. Yep. So, that comes as a surprise to me. So always learn something on these. That's great. Right. What about, I hear often about culture fit, and everybody talks about culture fit. Everybody's like, I gotta have really good soft skills. I gotta have good culture fit. I think often culture fit is just code for some sort of bias. How do you ensure that people are going to contribute to diversity of thought, but then also fit in with your team? If how do you build a cohesive team, but then also make sure that you have diversity of thought? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I agree. I think 90% of the time that people say culture fit, it's really just a way to exclude people. And I think it's because most teams and most organizations do a very poor job at defining what their culture actually is, with any level of intentionality. And so culture ends up becoming the, go along to get along type of approach. And so I always recommend leaders start there, is identifying what culture are you trying to build? What values are important to your team or to your organization? And then what are you going to do to enforce those values? Because if you focus on values as opposed to kind of individuals or the kind of the way that they behave, and focus more on the values that we expect to see out of people and the values that we expect to be exemplified, then it kind of takes the conversation up a level to where, let's say, one of your values is being supportive of each other. Though that's going to look wildly different for each person in the way that they support people. And it opens you up to be able to appreciate and understand those different types of approaches towards that same end result. And so if you focus on the value levels, it kind of keeps you out of the mud of individual characteristics and things like that, where it starts to delve into exclusionary, sometimes discriminatory practices where you're kind of excluding everybody from this little posse you've created.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it seems like everything you do is very intentional. You bring a lot of intentionality to the things that you do. I mean, even talking about culture, it would seem like that there would be kind of a best practice. Maybe you sit down with your existing team. Obviously, it's going to be difficult to do with your whole company, but at least your immediate team, maybe sit down with a whiteboard, and if you can, if you're in person, otherwise virtual whiteboard, and have people throw out terms that you think might be associated with your culture and discuss those and make sure that everybody feels the same way, and distill that down into a list of adjectives or whatever, and get a sense, map this whole thing out, like make it tangible. And then you can, through interviews, obviously some of it's art, some of it's science, but through interviews, you can determine whether or not somebody matches with those values, and you can be more intentional about the questions that you're asking or the topics that you discuss. If you're not going to be as specific, as to go so far as mapping out exact questions like you mentioned before. So, intentionality. And I suppose folks in GRC would be very good at this sort of thing. Documentation, document everything. And it is a best practice. And I think a lot of teams, they get so operationally saturated, they do a poor job of documenting everything. And it just makes everything in the future so much easier. But it takes some time investment up front. And I think that's where, companies get bogged down, especially when, say somebody quits and you have to backfill that position yesterday. If at that point you're trying to scramble and figure out how do we hire this person, and you haven't mapped it out previously, it's going to be more of a mad dash. But if you've mapped out your process and everybody is on the same page about what they're asking all new candidates, it all becomes so much easier. Any best practices for documentation, organization, anything like that?
Yeah, I think it goes back to that succession and resiliency planning that you were talking about earlier, is just always asking yourself, what happens if this person, including myself, were to be gone tomorrow and just never come back? And what would we do? And I think when you take that lens to it, it helps you to identify what documentation would we need in order to be able to withstand that. What processes would we need to be in place for things to be able to continue running? Because once you've been in any type of corporate environment for any amount of time, like you've seen the weird situations that will happen that will end in somebody leaving, sometimes with no notice. Like we had when I was at one organization, we had an individual who was big into the Wall Street's Bet Reddit channel and became a multimillionaire overnight and quit his job and said, "I'm retiring." And you would never expect that in most corporate environments. If you can imagine it, it's going to happen. And so asking yourself that ahead of time and then working backward from there of, okay, what things is this person responsible for? Who else knows how to do them? Where is it documented on how to do those things? And kind of working backwards from there, the exact same way we do in security with an attacker. It's just right now, or the risk we're looking at is not an external threat actor compromising our environment. We're talking about a person who is responsible for a process, and the threat is them leaving. And so if you kind of threat model it the same way you would any security scenario, you can really start to map out your controls. And often one of your controls is going to be documentation. And so it just ends up making sense.
Absolutely. What about documentation when it comes to job descriptions? That's a topic that's on, I think, a lot of people's minds. And it's one that so many people get wrong, or I should say so many organizations, because I think sometimes the issue is when you have too many hands in the cookie jar, there's too many people touching that job description, and it gets
Yep.
cobbled together, and it ends up looking extremely bloated and disjointed and things like that. Any thoughts on process or who should be putting together job descriptions and how to create one that isn't going to turn off every candidate that looks at it?
Yeah, so it is one of the more challenging parts of hiring, especially if you work for a larger organization, because they do have, a governance process for what job descriptions get put out there, how they have to be, how they have to look, what needs to be in them, et cetera. For a variety of reasons, but this being one of them, I always encourage every hiring manager and especially every CISO to have a very robust relationship with HR. Security is ultimately a people problem, and so you will need HR's support. But it becomes especially prevalent when you're talking about hiring and job descriptions, because HR usually owns TA, and so you're going to have to go through that process. And so start having the conversations with HR and TA before you need to hire somebody, so that it's not this kind of mad dash of, oh, I need to backfill this person. I need to get this posted so that I can get interviewing, and thinking, again, thinking farther down the road than what the problem is in front of you. And so, for example, when I first got to this organization, one of the first things I did was start partnering with HR to revamp all of our job profiles, which has an impact on our job descriptions, and then rebuild the process for how a job description is created and how it's published out to the world. And it took us 9 months, I think, to get that done. So it was a process. If I had waited until I needed to hire somebody, there's no way that would have happened. So think ahead and partner with HR. We often take this kind of adversarial relationship with HR. We don't want to talk to them. They don't want to talk to us until we absolutely have to. And so, of course, the results are poor. But I very, very rarely run into any HR personnel who are not willing to partner if you take the time to understand their perspective, understand their processes, understand what rules are in place and what ones you might be able to bend a little, and what ones you can influence. And I think when you take that kind of proactive partnering approach, your results are going to show.
Absolutely. Yeah. So being proactive and, once again, very intentional with your relationship with HR, just like everything else you do. So that's great. So we're coming up on time. So I got to ask you the one last question. Is there anything that we are not talking about in the industry, but we should be, especially as it relates to hiring?
I think it started to become much more of a conversation over the past couple of years. But the way that we identify and develop talent within the industry, I think, needs to continue to be more of a focus for the industry. I think we have become heavily reliant on certification bodies who are teaching often outdated information, if not outright wrong information. And we've kind of outsourced that piece of development and said, oh, go get these certs and then you're ready. And then we get the results of these people and we're frustrated because they don't understand their job. They don't understand security in a practical sense. And so what I would encourage every hiring manager to start thinking about is really taking more ownership over the development of your people and the people within your organization, and focusing on how they're going to be taught the right things instead of just handing them a list of certs or a degree path that they need to go do, and really, really focus on how you're going to develop people for not only the problems your organization are facing today, but the problems your organization are going to be facing over the next few years.
Yeah, and that would go back to having job profiles, in your case, having job descriptions that are closely aligned to specific roles, understanding what's really needed in those roles. And so if somebody has that job title, that job description, but they don't have, X, Y, and Z skills, that's a way for you to determine, or at least start to think about, how do we develop these people in these areas, and be very intentional about that, like you said, versus just handing somebody off to get a certification. I saw that quite a bit in the consulting world. It was a big drive to get people certifications because it was an easy way to sell work. But at the end of the day, it's really more of the day-to-day experiences that those auditors were getting that was more valuable to their knowledge base than getting their CISA, or CISA, depending on how you view how to pronounce that one. But yeah, it's been a great conversation, Michael. If people want to find you online, what's the best way to do so?
LinkedIn is the best way. I also have a website, michaelmeese.com, where you can see some of the talks that I've done before. But feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, as you and I did. And I'll always love to have a good conversation on there whenever I have the time.
Awesome. Well, appreciate your time, Michael, and thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Talent Gap Fireside Chat. Don't forget to follow our page on LinkedIn and like and subscribe on Spotify and YouTube. Hit that notification bell to be notified when we drop a new episode. New episodes air every Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern.